More financial uncertainty for people to contend with this week, sandwiched between the rising cost of living and interest rates, a big banking collapse south of the border, the likes of which we haven't seen in over a decade. Not one, but two financial institutions in the United States went belly up: California's Silicon Valley Bank and New York-based Signature Bank. SVB's demise in particular, spurred by people withdrawing billions of dollars within hours. That run on the banks sent global markets into a frenzy. And the ripple effect stretched across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. A last-minute loan by Switzerland's central bank was needed to save Credit Suisse from going under. But all of this is raising questions and fears about another financial crisis. Why is this happening now? And whether or not your money is safe in the bank. That's where we're diving into, or what we're going to dive into today on the Sunday Conversation. Joining me now from Toronto, Vas Bednar, Executive Director in the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University. And in Quebec City, freelance writer Nora Loretto. Good morning to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
So Vas, I'll start with you here. What are your takeaways from this past week? Why are these banks failing right now?
Sort of a combination of under-regulation and their unique situation, and kind of a social media accelerated bank run, right, is what we saw with SVB in particular. So the contagion of that fear and anxiety leading people to sort of pull their deposits and sort of further accelerate the collapse of that bank in particular.
And Nora, we do keep hearing that this isn't just sort of a rehash of 2008. Some people pointing to what Vas is just talking about, that there is that sort of social media dynamic here that perhaps we haven't seen in the past. So what do you make of this? Do you think that we are seeing something like what we saw back in 2008?
Well, let's keep in mind that 2008 had multiple factors that led to the economic crisis. But we should also keep in mind that our economy is fragile and economic crises are going to happen. And are we at the start of one? It's anyone's guess. I don't know if you've received direct messages on Twitter telling you to remove all your money from the banks, but I've certainly received many messages telling me to do that. Mm-hmm. And so that is a really interesting dynamic in this. But, we're Canadians, and I think that as Canadians, we need to look at what the Canadian banking system looks like. I know that we're going to probably talk more about that than about the United States, but what happens in the United States has big impacts on us because Canadians don't understand how the banking system works here and might look at SVB and think, oh my goodness, is my money safe in the TD Bank, for example, which it is. But it does raise a lot of other questions because regulation and a lack of regulation, it doesn't just plague the banking system, it plagues all parts of our economy. And it's deregulation or a lack of regulation that does trigger these crises.
Vas, I want to talk a little bit about some of the language that we've heard from officials in the U.S., because the U.S. government and analysts have been really quick to say that this isn't a bailout in the way that it was in 2008. This is, of course, when we're thinking about some of those funds that investors had in SVB, for example, trying to make sure that people feel like that money has been restored, but like we say, not calling it a bailout. Do you buy that?
Do I buy it? I mean, I think people are sort of trying to understand what an appropriate amount of risk is here and the risk appetite for people who were banking with SVB in particular. So though the Biden administration has taken pains to say it's not a bailout because the funds have been backstopped by FDIC, like the insurance element, who pays into that insurance element? It's people with their everyday banking fees. So inadvertently, our citizens in America sort of contributing to saving this bank, yes, but it's in a less traditional way than before.
Nora, how do you think Canadians should be thinking about this? How concerned do you think that they should be the safety of their own investments in their own banks?
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I think that you should be not concerned. The money in the Canadian banking system is not going to evaporate in the same way. thanks to many different regulations that we have. But we have other problems in Canada. And I think that this does give us an opportunity to step back and say, there's benefits in having a highly centralized banking system where there's only 5 banks because they're easier to oversee and regulate, but it also gives them a lot of power. And so for me, I'm sitting here saying, okay, well, let's look at the Canadian banking system. Let's look at the profits that have almost reached $40 billion annually. Every year there's more and more profits. And where are those profits coming from? And does it make sense for us to have all of our money or all of our mortgages or all of our credit card debt in a single bank? Or should we be encouraged to look at other alternatives like credit unions? I think that there's a lot of misconception about how things operate in Canada because we are so used to looking at the United States. And I think that this moment gives us an opportunity to say, well, do the banks in Canada have too much power? Yes, maybe our money is safe, but are we paying too much to these banks? Probably with the profits that they're making. Why aren't banking employees unionized in this country, which would, of course, take a chunk of the profits out to make sure that people have better wages and working conditions? Bank closures, like you can't actually see anyone anymore, which causes a huge problem for people in small towns. There's a lot of interesting questions and discussions that we can have in Canada. And luckily, it isn't really starting with, do I need to put all of my money into my mattress right now?
Vass, what do you make of that? What do you think?
Yeah, building from Nora's points, I think Canadians could be concerned on kind of 2 fronts. One is, if we move away from the savings aspect of a bank, the Silicon Valley banks served a particular function for many startups in terms of their access to capital. And as we have this moment in Canada where we're thinking about the innovation economy and building back better, and, it's actually very hard for startup entrepreneurs to access capital because the banks are so focused on lending against physical assets, right? And these are intangible markets. So one, we need to think about, the potential chilling effects and our venture capital industry. But 2, just like going back to 2008, where the Canadian banking system kind of had this magnificent halo because they kept our country safe, I think it reduced our scrutiny of the banks, not our regulatory scrutiny per se, but our banks are not fully kind of altruistic institutions here, right? They nickel and dime us with junk fees. They appear to act in a coordinated fashion sometimes in terms of when certain fees rise and how much. So I'm all for us kind of stepping back and taking a good hard look at not just how our banks are regulated, but also how they behave and how they can become better from a consumer-centric standpoint, but also asking some questions about, what does the startup industry need and can they actually access it here in Canada? Because Silicon Valley Bank was supporting some Canadian firms. They had a modest loan book, but there were some ripple effects here too.
I want to talk about the role of social media in all of this as well. And Vass, I'll stick with you here just for a second. Okay. Watching this play out in real time on social media. Yes, social media did exist back in 2008. I don't know that it was quite as big a part of our lives as it is maybe now, but watching how this played out on social media, how when word of SVB started to get out, that a panic actually started to play out on social media as well. What do you make of all that? The fact that people were getting their information about what was going on social media and that they were then making decisions based on that. And a lot of it, in some ways, seemed to be quite emotional.
Right. Also text message groups, kind of closed forum, Discord groups. This is something that we can't regulate. It's actually a behavior almost swarming like that we've seen more often with certain cryptocurrencies. I think that has now spilled over to a more formal banking system. And one wonders, no matter how well a banking system or other governance institutions, as Nora was pointing to, are regulated, is there an inherent vulnerability to the collective action that can be misguided or misplaced, but that can be spurred by social media? As for watching it play out, surreal, kind of exciting, strange, but this is how fast issues move now and how fast we're also prompting our regulators to be able to respond, right? In a weekend, that was pretty incredible from a U.S. standpoint that by Monday, Tuesday, they had a plan in place and kind of key messaging. I think that has to be shouted out too.
Nora, what do you think the broader, longer-term implications of some of these failures? What do you think that's going to be?
Yeah, I mean, like let's take a look at a lot of these other regulatory failures that have been in the news. Like there's train derailments and the deregulation within the rail industry. There's we're 6 to 10 people have died in Montreal just this past weekend because of Airbnbs that were illegal, and there's lack of regulation there. I mean, we are witnessing a transformation, and this transformation has been going on for a long time of the Canadian economy to tip the balances in favor of people making the profits. And so there's that whole angle to this, which is allowing the banks in the United States to operate in a way that was very, very risky because of a lack of regulation. And this is the outcome. This is what happens. Now, in the banking industry, sure, you can bail out the banks. You can find out insurance payouts to make sure that people don't lose all of their money. But there's other industries where people not only lose money, but they also lose their lives. And so I think that we should be looking at this as, not in the United States and saying, well, like, what is the role of regulation and why do we have regulation? And why do so many people call regulation red tape when actually it's literally the thing that's making sure that we're not eating spoiled food or that we're not going to get in an airplane and it's not going to fall out of the sky. These things are all very connected. And I think when it comes to the banking industry, Canada has a very strong credit union system, which is very important because credit unions not only are community based and are actually democratic. We can get involved in the governance structures of these bodies, but they also help to fund initiatives within communities. And what we don't talk enough about is the role the banks play in funding the tar sands, for example. And so there's a lot of real conversations that need to be had. But I think that a lot of politicians are allergic to these conversations, and so it's very difficult to have them in a mainstream way.
Fast final word to you here on possible long-term consequences of all this.
I would go back to thinking hard about our venture industry and startup and kind of the risk appetite that we have there, and sort of encouraging our capital B banks to be more thoughtful in that regard, because otherwise we push people arguably to riskier alt lenders, but also keeping in mind the policy power of our banks, who do lobby our government, and often we see very powerful former politicians take pretty sweet gigs at banks, and one wonders what that says about their relationship to our decision makers too.
Okay, we are going to leave it there for today, but I want to thank both of you for joining us this Sunday morning on a topic which I suspect we are going to continue to talk about in the coming days and weeks. But for now, thank you so much to both of you. Vas Bednar, Executive Director of the Master of Public Policy Program at McMaster University, and freelance writer Nora Loretto.